Awesome, Sri. Thank you so much for taking your time, and I've been very looking forward to speaking with you. So thanks for joining.
Yeah, of course. Likewise. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. And then you have an amazing background, great working at great companies, playing important roles at those companies. That maybe to start, if you could share a little bit about, highlights of your career, what you did in the last few careers, that'd be great to start.
Yeah, happy to give a little bit of an overview. I've become what I would say almost a reluctant growth and marketing leader. And I say that not because I don't enjoy the work. It's more, I didn't set out, at the outset of my career to become a growth and marketing person. I started off in a much more traditional business path, management consulting at McKinsey, private equity at Bain Capital, a couple of other investing roles. And then really what I wanted to do was become an operator, help build a business from the inside rather than being an investor and an allocator. So I joined my first startup, Opendoor, which at the time was a Series B company, 40 people. Over the next 4.5 years while I was there, the company grew to nearly 2,000 people, 5 billion plus in revenue. And I got to do all sorts of operational roles. I led sales, I led analytics, led pricing, finance, etc. And then I joined Instacart right at the beginning of the pandemic, which is, as you can imagine, was a very interesting time to be at Instacart. There was a tremendous boom in the core business, as well as one of my key roles there was to help build out the ads business, which is obviously a B2B revenue line. And I was there for a couple of years doing that and started specializing more in growth work. And then after that, I joined Ramp when we were about 70-ish million in ARR, and was there for a little under 2 years. And by the time I left, we were at 300 million plus in ARR. And I'm now currently leading marketing for a small public company called The Real Real. It's a luxury resale marketplace.
Awesome. And I think you're very well known as, you're the leader and experts in the kind of growth kind of industry. But when did you start actually using the title of kind of growth? Like, was that someone give you, or did you come up with the term of growth? Like, how did you become the growth expert?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in the Valley and in tech in general, the notion of like a chief growth officer or is still a relatively rare one. It's really come up over the last, let's call it 5 to 10 years. Luke Levesque, who's the chief growth officer at Shopify, is probably one of the more famous folks with that role. But it has been an unusual title, or it's been an evolution of an existing field, which is around marketing, right? I think historically, what's different about growth versus market? Maybe let's start there. The way I kind of think about growth is it is an evolution of marketing that takes into account the fact that customer acquisition has become more of a product and data-driven function, acquisition and retention, and revenue growth more broadly, right? And whereas previously, you would spend some money offline marketing and hope to get some customers. I think increasingly there are ways to engage prospects and customers via product. And increasingly, a lot of the spend is going digital, where you really need to be very smart about ROI and how you allocate your budget across a variety of different channels, and with the hybrid approach, thinking about attribution as well. So the nuances of marketing are becoming more and more technical, and there's better ways to turbocharge marketing with growth product. So the way I kind of think about what growth product is, or growth is really, is a combination of all of these fields, and it's a team that's ultimately responsible for the top line growth of a company. And there's obviously many components, and different companies organize them differently, and happy to talk about the various nuances there over our conversation today. But maybe I'll pause there. That's kind of how I think about growth, and how I've kind of ended up there.
Awesome. And then in terms of the org chart, does that usually report up to CEO or report up to sales leaders, marketing leaders, any typical kind of org chart that looks like?
Yeah, there's so I think that a main decision to be made with respect to growth is whether your growth team is only focused on the product element of the equation, or if they're also focused on marketing channels, right? If the challenging thing here is it's difficult to find a leader that can manage both and can succeed at doing both. And there's often organizations are organized such that like product and technology sit at a different vertical from go-to-market verticals. And what's interesting about growth is, if, in my opinion, for it to be constituted well, you need to have both the product element of growth as well as the marketing and the go-to-market element of growth under the same house. And so that can cause some organizational friction in terms of like solid line versus dotted line and which teams within growth report to growth or not. So if you have a pure traditional growth marketing team, which would mean things like paid marketing, SEO, offline demand gen, field marketing, and things like that, that would report into a CMO or a CEO, depending on the stage of the company. You know, early stage companies obviously don't and shouldn't have a CMO role typically. So if such a role doesn't exist, it typically reports to the CEO. Sometimes there is a head of go-to-market or a CRO type of person, and growth can sometimes report there. Having said that, the flip side is if you're a very PLG oriented or product-led company more generally, your growth team might primarily be product oriented, product management basically, in which case you might have that team report to your chief product officer or, you know, co-founder leading product or tech or something like that. Those are the typical combinations I've seen in terms of how the growth team is structured.
Awesome. And usually company have separate marketing team, separate product team, separate sales team, and then separate growth team where you worked out?
Yes. If growth is separated from, there is such thing as growth product versus core product. Typically, growth product is focused on acquiring customers in the funnel and closing them. That is, you know, very clearly growth acquisition product. And then there's growth kind of like activation and retention product efforts as well. Those sometimes work very closely and deal with the core product development of features. And sometimes they can work more independently. Acquisition works much more independently than retention and activation, I tend to find. And so if that's the case, then you can have it separate from each of those functions that we've talked about. But as I've said, I think more often than not, you will have growth team either report into product or report into marketing is what typically happens. So if it's reporting into product, there will still be a remaining product function, like a core product function. And if it's reporting to marketing, there's all these other functions of marketing that are typically not considered growth, like PR, brand, comms, product marketing, which are not typically a growth marketing functions.
Got it. That makes sense. And then what do you do to make sure that, you know, the cross-functional team kind of work, you know, with the harmony and everything? Because I can see the marketing team thinks, oh, that's my job, you know, why are you doing? And product team thinks, oh, that's my job, why are you doing? That kind of stuff. Like anything you do to make sure that doesn't happen?
I think when companies are in kind of startup and hyper growth phase, I think this is less of a problem because there's way more work to do than people to do it, regardless of what, you know, functional lines you draw. And folks should just be working on the highest impact work. Having said that, as you said, I do think it is helpful to clarify what the roles and responsibilities of each folks are. And I generally tend to find that the best way to do this is to like articulate and clearly share like you know, what we call a RACI framework, which is like, you know, who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed on a given decision-making process, using that to clarify who does what, right? So if you have a growth team at Ramp, we had a growth product team that was focused on acquisition that reported to me, but was dotted line into our product leader. And we had a, you know, SEO and paid marketing and field marketing and a couple of other teams that were more classic growth marketing teams that also reported to me. And initially I was reporting to CEO. Subsequently, when we hired a CMO as the company matured, I was reporting to that person. And so the way we kind of aligned on, you know, who's responsible for it, it's like very clearly anything growth product reports into growth, and we drew a clear line on when that, you know, responsibility would shift to the core product team, which would be after a customer signed the contract. So once the contract is closed, all of the product work that happens after, we said happens in the core product. But you can draw that line any different ways. But I do recommend having some sort of line where you decide, okay, this is where the growth product work ends and the core product work begins. That's on the product to marketing side. Then on the marketing to sales side, there's also, I think it is helpful to clarify kind of what are the pipeline goals and channels that are owned by marketing versus sales. and having marketing directly accountable for that pipeline, I think is a better way to organize. So a lot of companies in enterprise are tempted to have marketing be responsible for MQLs, the marketing qualified leads. And then once they convert into sales qualified leads, and sales team is responsible for, the closed won pipeline. The challenge with that kind of structure can be that you can have lead quality scores and others to mitigate this, but often the challenge can be, the marketing team is hitting their MQL goals, but the sales team is not able to close, the same amount of business. Then the classic kind of pointing game happens where the marketing team is like, look, our leads are great. We're doing our job. We're hitting our goals. And if they're not closing, it's because of the sales team quality in terms of their process and their systems. And the sales team will say the opposite. We're saying, no, actually, when we get high quality leads, our close rates are very high. Like we're getting a different mix or whatever. So this is where like having like an agreed upon like lead quality score framework for the company is helpful. But another way to solve this is actually to have the marketing team own the closed won goal for the channel that they're responsible for, which is how we managed it over time at Ramp, where we weren't just responsible for delivering the MQLs, we were responsible for the dollars of closed won business that was generated from the MQLs generated from marketing. And so that made us much more aligned with the sales team, even though that made it harder for us because obviously we can't control the conversion process.
Right.
Those teams don't report to us, but we just kind of took that as, if that's failing, then we should just act as citizens responsible for our funnel and work with the sales team to improve the funnel conversion. So just kind of aligning incentives there, because the sales teams ultimately still get paid on quota based on leads that are generated both from sales and marketing, right? Mm-hmm. So they're definitely incentivized to close the deals, but they might prioritize deals differently depending on which are easier to close. And this is where like actually having a little bit of tension and intentional friction can be a good thing.
Got it. That makes sense. Awesome. So it sounds like the major KPIs you mentioned, that maybe a company can measure the growth team success is one is the MQL, so the number of leads that you generate, and then the dollar or number of closed won through the leads that you generate from your channel. So those are the main two that you recommend usually?
Yeah. So I would, in general, so anytime in B2B software, you can pick any part of the funnel that you want the growth or marketing team to be responsible for. And there's always trade-offs, right? Like if you think the ultimate goal of the business is to generate cash flow, you can make the marketing team responsible for cash flow goals in a given quarter. But obviously that's so far removed from their ability to have impact that would probably not be a good metric because they don't know what inputs drive outputs, and it's not going to be motivating for them. It's going to sound like the outputs are very random compared to their inputs. And versus, as we talked about, if you pick something very up funnel like MQL, marketing qualified leads, then you have the problem of kind of like throwing something over the wall and the team not feeling responsible for the end-to-end quality of the work that they deliver. So the way to solve this is typically pick a metric that's farther down enough the funnel that it's highly correlated to the final outcome, cash flow, revenue generation, whatever you want to call it, but is also highly influenceable by the activities of the team. So typically picking like dollars of SQL pipeline or dollars of closed won pipeline and having that be a marketing / growth goal as well is something that I think tends to work better in a lot of companies.
Got it. Totally makes sense. Thank you. Do you think every SaaS company should have a growth team at a certain point?
Yeah, I think yes, but I would qualify that with it depends on how you define growth, right? Just as we talked about, I think growth is kind of like a pick and choose. There's a bunch of modules within growth, and which ones you pick depend on how your organization is structured and what your business model is, right? And how it becomes more important. I would argue that there are some companies that basically only have growth teams for a long time. They don't have marketing or sales teams, right? If you have a PLG product that's bottom up, like Slack was a classic example of this in the early days. They were basically a product-led growth company for a long time, and I'm sure there was a marketing team that was separate that got built over time, but really a lot of this work was product driven, and so I think it just really depends on what is your kind of business model to a certain extent. But I tend to find that you benefit from bringing people that are have a growth discipline, which I fundamentally do believe is a different thing than marketing or product. And so I think there's value in bringing people in that have done growth, which is a combination of those two functions.
Awesome. Is there a timing or stage that you recommend to build a higher growth team? Should the company hire from day one, or should they hire a little later stage, or anything you have advice on?
Yeah, I would generally think about hiring a growth like leader or somebody more senior once you're well past product market fit. Pre-series A, growth is everybody's job, especially the founder's job. They need to figure out what works. And then so the way I kind of think about it is, for most B2B companies, you do kind of founder and investor-led sales in the beginning and really understand what works. Once you have, numbers of customers, then you can hire your first kind of salesperson to prospect and really understand, where are these customers, what resonates with them, how do we talk to them, right? And once you have that set up, that's when you can kind of start thinking about investing in a growth person and team, who then thinks about, okay, how do I scale these insights and about where the customer is, what they want, and try to attract a lot more leads via scaled channels or growth motions. And of course, you have to be ready to be able to close those leads if you get a lot of leads via having an SDR team or having a self-serve close or something like that. But that's kind of how I think about it. I think like growth is everybody's job until you're well past product market fit. And so around the Series B-ish phase is where you want to start hiring a bunch of full-time people into growth.
Totally. Makes sense. Awesome. And I think in the previous interview that I watched, I think you mentioned there are 3 phases when building a growth team. Is there something you can elaborate, what that means and what those definitions are?
Yeah. So I think these are kind of 3 core notions to building anything, right? Because it's very hard to optimize for speed, quality, and cost at the same time. So you need to focus on different elements of the system as you go on, and over time, all 3 will be important, and you'll need to make balances on each of them. I think the first, when you're first starting a team, what you actually want to do is create a culture and a system that's designed for velocity. So can this team come up with experiments and ship them fast? Do they know how to scope MVP? Do they understand how to do things in a workable way? I think what you tend to find when you hire a lot of smart people, which a lot of great companies do, is they have an instinct towards perfection. And what you actually need to correct for is an instinct towards speed. What's important is failing quickly. Because one thing that I iterate, and I've seen this over large numbers of experiments at various companies, is the failure rate for growth experiments is quite high. It's something like 70% plus of growth experiments fail. So you can't be waiting for the perfect test. You have to be comfortable with shipping things quickly, learning, failing quickly and conclusively, and iterating. And so step 1 would be like building a team and a system and a culture that is focused on executing quickly. And then step 2, once you've got that, it's like, okay, great, is to raise the bar on quality. So do we impact score well? Are most of our tests conclusive? Like, are we really learning from each test? Et cetera. And of course, that'll slow us down a little bit, but we still have an instinct towards speed while we focus on improving on quality, right? Like, let's create the better tests that give us the better reads, et cetera. And once you have that, then you work on cost optimization, which is, okay, like, do we really need to spend $50,000 on a test? Do we really need to staff 1.5 person on something to get it done, et cetera, et cetera? And then I think that the third phase is where you really try to optimize on scaling those tests in a cost optimal way. That's one way to think about it. There's lots of different journeys of growth teams, but I think that's what you're referring to about the phases. So
Yep. Thank you. So, there's a kind of process and phase that you mentioned for kind of growth team to work out. In general, if, we if I run a SaaS company, let's say 10 million ARR, let's build a growth team and hire a growth leader to build a team. Like how many quarters do you think will give me enough time to assess that this team is working, this direction is working, or, that kind of, do you know roughly time frame?
The great thing about growth teams is you kind of know pretty quickly because their job is to make the number go up. And if they can't make the number go up, something is wrong. Either they're not testing enough things or the quality of the tests isn't very high, right? That's the first
Hmm.
phases that we talked about. And so I typically think after 2 quarters, if you're not seeing the right inputs, it might be time to make a change. So at least the inputs should look right. Like, are they launching enough tests? Are they being thoughtful about the tests that they're launching? And if you get that sense, then you might want to give them more time, right? And maybe it's just a matter of iterating into it. But that would be my guess is like 2 quarters, you kind of know. But if the inputs are good, I might give them 2 more quarters. But I think you know pretty quickly.
Awesome. And for the growth leader, like, is there any typical type of background that you see if who's going to be successful in the role? Like, growth leader might be a little newer term in the industry, so maybe there are
Yeah.
not that many people like you that we can try to hire. But is there any type of people that you've seen
Yeah,
succeed?
I tend to find there are kind of 3 profiles of folks that fall into growth leaders. There's folks that come from a product background. There's people that come from an analytics background, and there's people that come from more of a marketing background. And I think depending on the specific person, of course, and the type of company, any of those can be great. I'm of course biased towards the people that come from more of an analytical and financial background because that's what I'm from. But I think that's what you want to look for is you want to look for a company that you admire and see if you can find a growth person that was there at that company early, or if not, somebody that reported to them as kind of your recruiting strategy, right? So if you're you know, obviously like Airtable and Notion, and there's a bunch of other companies that were at some point product-led growth companies that had growth product leaders, right? Loom is another one where a friend of mine used to do that. And so there are enough companies out there that have been known to do this well that you can find specific growth leaders. I think the easiest ones to identify on LinkedIn will be the ones with more of a product background. And then the marketing ones will also be relatively easy to identify. I think the trickier ones will be, the kind of other backgrounds that we talked about.
I see, I see. Any favorite interview questions to identify if they'll be the right fit?
Yeah, I kind of think like what I'm usually looking for when I'm interviewing people is are people of high intellectual curiosity, have strong problem solving skills, and are adaptable to feedback, right? I tend to find that domain expertise fades, and if someone doesn't have it, it's also learnable. There's a lot of external resources these days, more so than ever, to pick up on the domain expertise. So I tend to not focus my core interviews on like asking the right question to find something from somebody, because people tend to be very well prepared about their past and about the standard interview questions. And I think it doesn't tell you really about how they might perform in a job environment, right? And so I'm usually very much in favor of doing a case interview style where it imitates a real problem that someone might work on in the future at the company. And so what you see through that process is, do they ask you the right follow-up questions? Are they intellectually curious about how this problem works? Are they able to think on their feet and structure the problem and propose a solution? And then how do they respond to your feedback to the solution and throughout the process? And I tend to learn a lot from people with the case interview format because of that. And so that's what I typically tend to do.
Do you have an example of that kind of case that
Yeah.
you can share? Like, is it as simple as what should be the Slack's growth strategy for the next 3 years, that kind of stuff, or?
I think it really depends on the role. The more senior the person, the more open-ended you want the case and the question to be. But having said that, I actually think you get the best conversations when you pick a much more constrained and straightforward problem. And I tend to use them based on things that are inspired by past employment, right? So we had a challenging pricing problem at Opendoor. So we basically converted that into a case that we would ask people, which is, hey, this is our average cost structure per home. This is what the fee would be if we charge that. Can you, but that doesn't work for us. Or so then we would say, like, can you help us figure out what the right fee should be? It's like relatively open-ended, but also there's some constraints, like we've given you some inputs, right? And so then you'll see, like, what are the additional questions the person asks to see if they understand the problem, how do they approach the problem, and then how adaptable are they to the feedback that you get. Another question that I've asked in the past is about my Instacart experience, inspired by my Instacart experiences, which is, you have $1 per order to invest in growth. How would you allocate it across the various parts of the company? And so
That's a pretty big question.
Yeah. And so they're just really, like, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to these case questions. They're really intended to help you understand how the person thinks, and if they if they have a style of thinking that will lead to better problem solving at your company.
Nice. Do you ask these kind of case question for any kind of seniority of the role that you're hiring? Like, would anybody say, "Oh, that's, I'm too busy to do that," that kind of reaction, and you lose candidates?
Even I've been at multiple companies where even C-suite people are expected to do like a detailed case and present to the panel. So I don't think you should ever feel like, someone is too senior to do a case. I mean, there might be cultural differences there. Having said that, I do remember we did interview, I think this was at Opendoor, where we interviewed somebody quite senior externally, who I think we probably gave him too many cases. I think every panelist wanted to do a case, and which probably didn't go over so well for the candidate experience. Because at some point, when someone's quite experienced and you have a lot of back channel references, you should have enough data points on what their capabilities are that you don't have to test them net new. But having said that, I think anybody that bristles at having to do case studies is not a fit for a growth stage company. It just means that to me, that's an indicator that they want to post on their past accomplishments and their domain expertise, and they're not as excited about solving new problems. I personally get excited about approaching, whenever a company gives me data or wants me to think about a problem that they're working on. I think it's fun. And if you're not enjoying that, then why are you trying to join the company? Because that is what the job is. So.
Got it. That's awesome. I agree. And also you can see the commitment from the candidates as well, right? And if they're not willing to spend another few hours, then maybe they're not that serious about the role as well. Awesome. And then let's say you're the growth leader and then you hire the growth team. What does the typical 90 days kind of look like for both you and then also the new hire? Like, do they follow you to understand everything, or do you give them assignment, or what's the typical 90 days look like?
Yeah, so my whole view is the best way to learn is by doing, and the best pace of learning is self-paced. So I'm not a big believer in, doing a week-long sessions of like onboarding sessions with a bunch of topics and a bunch of decks. And, sometimes people do it, but what I found is actually organizing content that's important about the company in an asynchronous way, and then doing interactive sessions with the person, which is, let's say, like, okay, this is all the material that we have on how our marketing function works. Why don't you read through that, absorb it, and we'll spend 30 minutes tomorrow where you can, or whatever amount of time, where you can ask me questions. And so that way it's like you're asynchronously absorb the information at whatever pace that you absorb as a normal individual. And then you're also getting to learn at the pace that you want to learn, because you're asking the questions and you're directing, versus like somebody lecturing at you or presenting information to you. I find it to be incredibly inefficient. And so that's how I like to onboard people. That's how I like to be onboarded typically as well.
I see.
So that's on the like self-paced onboarding piece. And the second piece is around just learning by doing, right? And so what I tend to do is give them something that we're already working on and be like, okay, just ship this thing in the next 2 weeks. So just go learn, figure out, write the scoping document, go work with whoever cross-functional stakeholders you have to work with, and actually ship this product or project. The best way for you, and it's usually like something small that's less risky, so that it shouldn't be crazy hard for them to go accomplish that. And so that's how we usually like to start off people. Is we have a project like for as soon as they come in. So while they're onboarding, they're also learning about this project, and it's happening all at the same time. It's not like one after another. And we have like like we literally do try to have people ship something in the first 2 to 4 weeks and then like celebrate that. And at least at Ramp, that was a big part of our culture.
Mm.
And then I also think, first 90 days, the faster you can just get somebody into the cadences and the rhythm of how your company works, I think is better. So let's imagine they start at the beginning of the quarter. Great. Like give them a quarterly OKR and a goal that they are a contributor to that they're going to hit, and let them figure out how to do it. Again, like obviously like ratchet up the risk based on your ability to assess their competency, because you obviously don't want to give somebody brand new a very important outcome without knowing how well they can perform that. And it's also like potentially too much pressure on the person. So like obviously allocate the project accordingly to the tenure and capability, but that's how I kind of think about it.
Got it. And for you to get onboarded, when you join as a first leader, is there any typical things you do yourself for the first, 10 days, 30 days, 90 days?
Yeah, I mean, I think step one for me is always to understand how lead gen works and dive deep into the data. Like where are our leads coming from? How good is our attribution data? What's our confidence on that? How are the leads performing across the funnel? And so that's the quantitative side. And on the qualitative side, I try to listen to calls, sales calls of closed customers and lost customers to see what customers think. And then I read through our NPS scores and product reviews as well to get a general sense for what customers are thinking. And I try to join some sales calls live as well so that I can see the reaction live and like try to participate just a little bit. But I think those are the most critical things when you first come in. And then obviously you want to learn about who all the cross-functional stakeholders are and what your resources are, and then the rest are also all important. But those are the two things that I think are critical for walking into a new role, whether as an individual contributor or frankly as a leader even.
That's awesome. And you mentioned that I think you set the goal for the quarter, whether it's through OKR or whatever the framework is. But is there any method you use to set the kind of right stretch goal for your team? Like ambitious but not ambitious enough. Especially from the super fast growing company that you've joined before.
I think it's always a balance, right? I would say the risk is always on setting goals that are too low, not too high. Because if you set a goal that's too low and it's accomplished, it sets a bar for, okay, well then let's incrementally increase the goal. Obviously we did well there, let's increase it by a little bit. Versus if you set a very high goal and they miss by a little bit, I think the risk for the business is a lot less longer term, right? Because what you want to know is learn the art of the possible. Having said that, if you've set goals that are so ambitious that the team has missed goals by a lot for 3+ quarters, I think they're going to lose confidence in your ability to set goals. And they're also going to feel discouraged in their ability to grow and learn. And in some cases, if they're a variable compensation person, to earn at the company, right? And so that's kind of how I would think about it. Is I would tell people that these are stretch goals, try to make them as aggressive as possible, and say, if you're getting 70 to 80% of your goals done, like you're doing well. So just kind of getting that giving people that psychological safety that they don't need to always exceed goals is an important thing. And then I think, as I mentioned, like if it really is, 3 quarters in a row of missing goals, I think you want to rethink about how you're setting the framework of goals. And also the goal setting process, by the way, it's not unilateral, right? There is a bottom up and a top down process. So before I confirm goals, I always like to do them independently. Like I think about the top down process, which is largely done by myself and maybe the finance or analytics team supporting me, which thinks about, what is the art of the possible in terms of like, where are we in our growth phase? What do other competitors do? What are we doing particularly well, particularly not well? And based on that, where do we think we can get to for this quarter? And then the team will look at the past and what their current capabilities are and come back with what they think the bottom up goal is. And then we try to, meet somewhere in between. Usually, their goal will be, their bottom up will be lower than the top down. And then you kind of, so those are two kind of independent points to help you get to the right place rather than having it be a sole, arbitrary decision.
Got it. That's awesome. Thank you. I talk a little bit about the kind of competitions. I think you've been part of the company who was in the very competitive market as well.
Yeah.
Do you do anything different based on like competitors? Like, do you change your growth strategy because of what competitors do, or do you only focus on your own market or own customers, that kind of direction?
Yeah, look, I think the reality is it's going to be very different based on the market that you're in, your competitive positioning versus your competitors. And I think depending on the size of the market, it can be very distracting and unnecessary to think about your competitors most of the time. Having said that, sometimes your competitors do things that are actually good and logical that you hadn't thought about, and it might be worth it to imitate them. Or vice versa, they are starting to copy something that you're doing, and that's making your customer acquisition difficult for you. So you need to think about how to innovate there. So there were, I do think for better or worse, actually having an enemy is very good. I think it creates a lot of internal discipline and morale and culture. Whether or not it's a true enemy or not, I don't know if you've seen the Michael Jordan documentary. It's excellent, but he talks about how he takes certain things personally. He'll find the smallest inspiration to challenge himself to do better, right? And I think having a kind of a corporate challenger it can be a good thing that way. So for Opendoor, we were the leader in the category until Zillow, who was the leader in the industry, decided to enter the iBuying category for us, right? At the time, we were like, oh my God, this is horrible. But a couple things. One is it actually helped us because a much larger player came into the space. It increased awareness of the category by quite a bit. And we got a lot more organic traffic, and people that were competing or searching for Zillow's product would obviously find Opendoor's product as well. Sure, there were some headwinds on customer acquisition, but by and large, it was okay. So a complicated decision that we had to make at Opendoor on competitors was when Zillow decided to start offering people more money on their homes than what we thought was a fair value, which it's another way of doing customer acquisition, right? Basically overpaying for inventory in this case, and we had to make a decision. Are we going to match Zillow's prices and lose money or not? And we were principled and we said, no, we believe in our prices. We think they're accurate. We think this is the right way to run this business. And if a customer says, hey, Zillow's giving me a better price, we say, hey, we want you to get the best price you can. Go with Zillow. That was a tough decision to make because it had growth impact at the time, but it turned out to be the right one. Zillow eventually was not doing well in this business, and they had to shut down the business and exit the market because of the mistakes they made on pricing. Whereas Opendoor obviously has its own challenges, but is an ongoing concern, and is again the leader in this category. And now Zillow partners with Opendoor to lead in this category. Same with Instacart. Over time, historically, Instacart didn't have much competition, but obviously more recently, DoorDash and Uber Eats are trying to enter the grocery category. And Instacart decided to double down on where they have the strength, which is building deeper partnerships with the retailers to create those exclusive or semi-exclusive relationships with the retailers, because selection is super important in this space. But having said that, we noticed that, some of our our competitors were offering faster delivery times for a different use case of the customer. Because Instacart historically was the core weekly once grocery shopping use case. And so to serve this new use case, we actually innovated. We like built out a separate product for express delivery, which is more of an on-demand delivery product than Instacart's batch delivery product. So we learned something from the market and added to our capabilities there. And in Ramp's case, I won't speak of the specific competitor, but there was a famous competitor that we had that basically changed their positioning to be very similar to Ramp's in the public sphere. Whereas like Ramp had come in with this like software first and kind of like positioning where we wanted to be the partner for the company in terms of being simple and focused on savings. As you know, some of our competitors copied our positioning, and then the question was, how do we react to that? I think in Ramp's case, we said we don't need to react to it because we're not actually competing with this other company. Our competition is the legacy expense management solutions and companies that don't even have a solution today. And so just focusing on our core TAM was we decided was the right thing to do and growing the way we are. And I think that turned out to be the winning strategy because the data obviously suggests that Ramp has overtaken all of our kind of newer competitors in terms of purchase volume.
Awesome. Very impressive. Thank you. Do you usually see growth team focus mainly on the new customers acquisition, or do you also see existing customers more activation or, cross-sell, that kind of stuff as well?
Yeah, so historically, of course, growth teams are very much focused on new customer acquisition. Having said that, I think the difference on whether or not you own the entire end-to-end funnel, honestly, really depends on how PLG your company is. The more PLG the company is, the more the growth team, which will work like a growth product team, will own end-to-end revenue generation. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of resourcing, it'll typically be, unless it's like a very PLG heavy product, growth teams will be focused much more on acquisition than retention and activation. Cross-sell, I kind of think about as actually just another acquisition, but with like a loaded, like a preloaded customer prospecting list, right? So I do think like acquisition and cross-sell go very much hand in hand where the growth teams work closely together. I think like retention and activation sometimes can be a very product-led exercise, which may or may not sit in growth. At Ramp, for during my latter half of my time there, the customer service CSM function was also reporting into me. Customer success management function was also reporting to me, which was focused on activation, right? And so there's definitely ways to structure it where more parts of the growth funnel sit under growth. But the way I would think about it is to expand the scope of the team based on the prioritization of your company and the impact that the team is having, rather than try to have them do everything at once. Like, again, constrained scope with expansion based on success would be the principle I would think about.
Got it. Awesome. You joined great companies in the past. Like, is there any trick like you find awesome company, like anything you do to find those companies, or you make them, awesome company after you join? Maybe both, but
I wish I could take credit for the amazing journey that these companies have gone on, which are largely, obviously because of the fantastic teams and founders that were there. But I think in terms of company selection, my at least for the three companies that we've been talking about a lot on this call, my historical path has been to follow where the talent goes. So whenever I speak to companies, you'd be surprised actually how easy it is to suss out which companies have high talent density and high talent bar versus which don't. So and I've talked to so many companies at this point and so many executive teams, and the best companies, when I talk to a bunch of people at the company, I'll walk out of that thinking I could work for any of these people. Like, I don't mind reporting to any of these people, regardless of their level and experience. And kind of the less good companies, what I tend to see is like, there's usually like one or two great executives or people that are there. And then the rest, I'm kind of like, And that's been my barometer for which companies I want to work at, and I think that's worked well for me. So hopefully smart people are making the right choice, or if not, as you said, smart people can change the trajectory of a company. So just find out where the best people are going, and that might be the easiest way to find your next job.
Awesome. I think the last question is any advice for people in Japan who are listening, who want to be the kind of growth leader like you in their career?
Yeah, I don't know if my advice is any differentiated based on, geography. I'm certainly no expert in Japan, so I can't give anything nuanced based on the Japanese market. But my advice would be, work on things that you find intellectually stimulating and challenging, and work with great people, both on the team as well as the founders and investors, and then just work on being intellectually curious and being adaptable, and I think the rest will follow.
Awesome. Great advice. Thank you
Yeah,
so much for amazing interview. That was
yeah.
awesome.
It was
Hope
great chatting
to
with you. Thank you for asking.